All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio. Been a few days since the most recent upload, and one of the projects that I was hoping to get back to in these series of podcasts is The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman. I've been going through the book of that same name, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman by Lyndon LaRouche, as well as some of his other associates, and we're kind of having a discussion about this particular subject. I mentioned in the first upload, as you see, this is part two, that I'm somewhat of a fan, a follower, someone who has dabbled in the works of both Lyndon LaRouche and Milton Friedman. And when I found out that LaRouche had written a book about him called The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, I was like, oh wow, I gotta read that. So I found a copy of it online for free from the University of Pennsylvania Library, and we've been going through some of the things here on this channel. In the first part of it, just to give a little recap, they really talked about how Milton Friedman was heavily influenced by the Nazi economics minister. That's the, I guess you would say, the Minister of Economics and Finance for Nazi Germany, Hjalmar Schacht. And then that is something that really carried on into kind of the economic vision that he created for Chile and General Pinochet. Like when Milton Friedman was advising Pinochet in Chile, he was kind of copying a lot of the sort of Nazi plans of Hjalmar Schacht. So says this book. So says, like, that's kind of just summarizing as opposed to arguing. One of the things that I would say in terms of commentary is that regardless of anyone's opinion on Milton Friedman, it's rather remarkable to note how many foreign governments he was actually working with, how that he inspired, whether you're talking about Estonia, Chile, as well as being an economics advisor to Margaret Thatcher's government, like in specifically the course economics ministry. Forgive me if I've, mislabeled that, but like more or less that's the general idea. So it's like Milton Friedman definitely had a very large influence on global economics. Now, in this particular thing, not only do they say that Milton Friedman was influenced by Nazi Germany, they also say that there is the sort of the underlying financial connection between Nazi Germany and the British Empire. And Hjalmar Schacht was, of course, friends with the British economics minister. So it's like you have the kind of economics ministry of the British Empire and the economics ministry of Nazi Germany kind of in a close relationship. And this carried on into something called the Chicago School of Economics. Now, this is one of the very interesting parts of the book here when they say very clearly that the Chicago School of Economics, which includes Milton Friedman, exists as a way to further the agenda of the British Empire. And this is something that the Lyndon LaRouche movement has talked about a lot in the past about how free market policies are all about furthering the agenda of the British Empire, sometimes referred to the British, like the British meaning like the British system of political economy based on speculation. Like when you sort of deal with the LaRouche movement, they might refer to the British Empire, but it's not just people, and it's not just territory. It's absolutely not about territory now. Their sort of thesis is that it's about, the financial connections. It's about everything: people, finances, how these things impact different parts of the world. It's sort of a more academic term, but they just refer to them as the British. If you think that that sounds a little weird, have you heard of the New World Order, the Anglo-American Alliance? The British are, it's very similar to the New World Order theories that are put out by a lot of other people. But it's a bold statement to say that the Chicago School of Economics was founded solely to further the agenda of the British Empire, which they're saying in this book here, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman. And in the first part of the podcast, I was quite critical of them, of Lyndon LaRouche and the people that worked on this book with him, for not citing their sources. I did find a few footnotes, and they do have footnotes in there when they quote big blocks of Milton Friedman's like speeches and such. And when they have direct quotes from Milton Friedman, they do put in a footnote. But when they have something like this, The Chicago School of Economics is founded, purely to further the British Empire. Not a single source, reference, or anything. They aren't even providing really an explanation about how they've come to that conclusion other than their own surmise, other than their own sort of assertion. I mean, and that maybe sort of be that might be it. You might view that as just sort of an unproven assertion, and I'd have to say that this book is filled with them. And this is one of the things where people are quite critical of the Lyndon LaRouche movement. I remembered a line from Arno de Borgrave back in the 1980s when he's like, the Lyndon LaRouche movement only uses the occasional fact. And I don't really think that low of them. It's more than occasional. But what he's sort of trying to say, or at least what I would say now, talking from me, what I would say is that they don't really cite the things very well, and they're treating a lot of opinions as facts or unproven assertions as fact. But this relates to something that is very large with the Lyndon LaRouche movement. They're trying to say that Milton Friedman and his free market policies, because remember, Milton Friedman's all about free market, all about freedom, all about, limited government, and allowing a strong private sector to move a country forward. All of those things, what he's trying to say is that that leads to the oligarchs dominating, that leads to tyranny dominating. And Mike Billington, who is with the Lyndon LaRouche movement, I hope I got his name right, he summarizes that very well when he's just like, when they want free trade, that leads to free drug trade and free slave trade. If you're just going to kind of blow up all of the sort of rules and regulations and break down all these barriers, that's just going to lead to kind of things that would depress humanity. There, and we talked about that in part one about, once again, another thing that was not provided any citations, but they said that the opium wars in Asia, which is again associated with the British Empire, led to the eventual consequence of an enormous amount of people in Hong Kong becoming addicted to heroin. They write that, but once again, no sources provided. Now, when we want to look at that, there's another interesting thing in the book. Milton Friedman was somebody that was against the draft, right? In the United States of America, when you turn 18, I'll tell you this as a guy, you have to fill out like the selective service card or something like that. I did that years ago. I remember doing it, but I don't remember all the exact name of the card. But selective service something in case they bring back the draft for the military, where you could be drafted to fight in the war. Milton Friedman, of course, is opposed to the draft because he's all about freedom, he's all about choice, and as well as limited government. I was very surprised when I learned that Lyndon LaRouche says in this book, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, that he is in favor of the draft. Because when you don't have a draft, then that allows the kind of enlisting a military that's based on enlistment, that preys upon the lower income classes, the people who don't have other opportunities. It sort of doesn't get people from a variety of educational backgrounds. It doesn't get people from a variety of economic backgrounds. So Lyndon LaRouche is actually in favor of the draft for that reason. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I've never heard anything like that before. No, I mean, like, I honestly will say that I have not heard that argument for the draft come from anyone else. And I would just think that, like, it kind of stands for itself. I don't think we need to give too many comments on that. And that'd just be something that I would let the people in the comment section, if anyone hears this far off corner of YouTube, what would you think about that? Like, that we should have the draft because it allows people from a variety of backgrounds to come into the military, and it doesn't allow the enlistment process to prey on people who are more desperate. I mean, it's a very extreme statement. If we have to give some commentary, I think that that is quite an extreme statement. But once again, it's like the Lyndon LaRouche movement makes a lot of extreme statements on a variety of subjects. What I would say about the LaRouche movement, because this is a LaRouche publication, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, is not only do they believe the opposite of what Friedman is saying, that it is the strong public sector that moves civilization forward as opposed to a strong private sector. What the LaRouche movement does is that they aren't completely far out. Arno de Borgrov, that guy I mentioned, says they only provide the occasional fact, right? What I've really found is that a lot of their interpretations are somewhat accepted by mainstream sources, or mainstream interpretations and LaRouche interpretations can often coincide. I was listening to a speech about from Lyndon LaRouche when he's talking all about Mick George Bundy, who was the former national security advisor. I hope I get this right, for Lyndon Johnson. And well, anyway, he's a former national security advisor, and he was heavily involved with making decisions associated with the Vietnam War. And then, like, a lot of the things that Lyndon LaRouche was saying about Mick George Bundy turned out to be completely in line with what's going on, in a mainstream publication that comes out, 20 years later, saying virtually the same thing. I believe that was called Lessons in Disaster or something like that, which is kind of all about Mick George Bundy and his role in Vietnam. And Lyndon LaRouche was saying that stuff 20 years earlier. So the fact of the matter is, the LaRouche movement is not always wrong. And I'm somebody who's kind of going to go out on a limb here and say that no, Milton Friedman isn't always wrong. He is someone who is another form of an extremist, except he is kind of a free market extremist. He wants there to be as little government as possible. However, though, I don't necessarily think that this LaRouche publication here, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the British Empire is, pushing forward these sort of ideas about trying to use free market policies to expand the role of this kind of New World Order stuff. Because this is like one of the things where we have to bring in somebody like Jesse Walker. On this channel, we've talked about Jesse Walker a few times, who wrote the book The United States of Paranoia. And what he says is that human beings, no matter who you are, humans are pattern-seeking creatures who kind of just have to create a narrative. We have to kind of look for events to compose a narrative. And this is why so many people look toward conspiracy theories. You try to interpret the data, whether it's historical or whether it's kind of political. You need to compose a narrative that would make sense to you. You're a pattern-seeking individual. And this is how a lot of the New World Order theories start. But the thing is, though, the New World Order, to some extent, and I don't know how popular this is of a statement, I would believe that it is somewhat of a boogeyman in the dark. Like, Alex Jones would always talk about the globalists, the tyrants, the social engineers. But, like, is this actually some really gross, calculated method? Or did things just happen this way? Or are we just dealing with the consequences of an inefficient and ineffective system? I think it's the latter somewhat. And like, what do you really mean by New World Order? Is like, what do they mean by the remnants of the British Empire? That the British Empire never truly fell. It just kind of morphed into something else, and it's using people like Milton Friedman to extend its reach around the world. It's a very extreme statement, and I don't think that they've proven their case to kind of establish it as a factual claim. They haven't proven that this is like something that is a fact beyond a reasonable doubt, but they make it seem that way. And I'm not going to act like Milton Friedman's policies are, like the most perfect thing in the world. If you watch Milton Friedman's speeches on YouTube and you look through the comments, you will just see people who are just in love with Milton Friedman. They're just like, oh, this guy is just brilliant. I mean, this guy is so smart. But the thing is, though, we have to be critical of everyone, especially people who are talking about like economics and economic forecasting the way Friedman and LaRouche did, because economic forecasting can really just turn into, someone who is selling a form of snake oil, because they're going to be like, listen to me, or there's going to be a financial crisis, and maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't, and then they'll be like, oh, if it does happen, I was right, and if it didn't happen, well, I told you to be prepared, just in case it did. And guys like this can really have a major impact on just kind of just generating a following, just getting people to sort of believe certain things. They have enormous amounts of influence. And we mentioned at the beginning that Milton Friedman isn't just some schmuck that was like writing articles or something like that. He carried, his influence to affect many different foreign governments, and we cited a few of them. But what I would say about the criticisms of Lyndon LaRouche is that I don't think he completely proved the point that, that these things are all just a result of the British Empire trying to use people like Milton Friedman as kind of a useful tool to extend its reach all across the planet Earth for global domination, which is more or less what this book is about, the ugly truth about Milton Friedman. And, like this is kind of the first 100 pages that we've really just tried to summarize, as well as in throwing in some other things just about general disagreements like being opposed to the draft, being opposed to the opium trade and its kind of negative effects on society. A lot of the things that are like that are also in the book. So there's kind of some general disagreements, as well as this kind of big theory that people like Milton Friedman are sort of a useful tool for the remnants of the British Empire. Because remember, the LaRouche movement argues that the British Empire did not fall. Like post World War II, post independence of India, no, that British Empire is still there. It just morphed into a different form. And especially in terms of rebounding in intelligence. And like there's used like sort of like their intelligence agencies, MI5, MI6, and so on. Well, I guess this little recording is coming to an end. This is only going to be the second part, as we're going to keep going through this book, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman. I hope to do more uploads. Once again, I know this is not the most popular thing in the world. I know this thing won't attract an enormous amount of views. I just found that this was an interesting subject. It's kind of coming from two different guys from very, very different backgrounds on the kind of political and economics thinking spectrum. Maybe you could even call them somewhat philosophical, both of these people, who have both now passed away. It's only been about a month since the passing of Lyndon LaRouche, and quite a while since the passing of Milton Friedman. But the thing is, and this is a very important thing that we need to say about both of these guys, LaRouche and Friedman, they weren't wrong all the time. And the mainstream media might have you believe that some of them were wrong all the time. And this is one of just the things that we have to recognize. When it comes to people who are somewhat extreme in nature, they might actually be sharing something of value. The problem is, there's also all this other stuff they're saying that isn't that valuable. So it's up to us as kind of the receivers, the audience, the people who are just listening to these very advanced discussions. I mean, I'm not an economist at all. I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not a historian. But at the same time, we are people who do want to know more, and we do want to challenge people, and we do want to learn. Because how else do people become economists and philosophers and historians? They have to learn and they have to start somewhere. So Milton Friedman wasn't completely crazy. And to LaRouche's credit, he does say that in the book. He wasn't a fool, he wasn't a dupe, he wasn't someone who was lying. He was more just kind of someone whom the British found useful, and like his policies were beneficial to them, as so they argue. And the same way, Lyndon LaRouche wasn't a fool either. He wasn't crazy. As I mentioned, like his interpretations of George Bundy are actually somewhat widely accepted, as well as some other things that LaRouche has talked about with certain, what was it, the elections in 1986 or something like that. But that's a far off example. We don't have to get into that. All right, well, once again, this little recording is coming to an end. Thank you so much if you've made it this far, and let's talk a little more next time.